Hey everyone, it's right around 11 a.m. on April 21st. I am going to be talking about Tobias Wolff and Hunters in the Snow, which is your final reading assignment. But before I get into that, I really need to stress a few things. First, we are almost to the end of the semester. This we are there. So as of right now, this moment, I have only received five from all classes, not just for one particular class. From all classes, I've only received five first drafts of the final essay. Um, I do need them as soon as possible if you want to get feedback on the first draft and have the opportunity, if you wish, to do a revision. If you get it to me too late, what you give me is what is going to be your final draft. Now, as far as dates go, uh, the absolute latest that I can accept anything from you all is going to be, I believe, let me double check this. Yeah, May 6th. May 6th is the end of the semester. That's finals week, everything. On May 6th, our semester is over, which means this class is over. That also means that if you send me your essay on May 7th, it's not going to be accepted. Not because I'm being mean, because the semester is over. I have been very lenient, especially with what's going on right now with the last essay, essay 3, with accepting late work without penalty. And I pretty much have been that way all semester because I understand, things happen. However, May 6th is the end of the semester. So if I don't have it by then, you receive a 0 on essay 4. And that's going to be a major, major impact on your grade. And I can't make exceptions to this. It is what it is. So I want to stress that. If I do not have your essay in my inbox, my email inbox, jbeatson@ggc.edu, if it's not timestamped on May 6th, it will not be accepted. So please, please get to work on those. And if you want feedback, you need to get them to me as soon as possible. The 5 people that have sent them to me already should be hearing back from me sometime today. So that said, let's get into our final author, Tobias Wolff. Uh, he was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1945. He's still alive, so at least we're ending with somebody who's still alive. I didn't do that on purpose. It just kind of worked out that way. So he's kind of semi-retired, I would say, but not really. He still teaches. He's still, as far as I know, he's still actively writing, but not to the capacity that he was, even as 5, 6 years ago. He's a very well-known author. Um, and what's kind of unusual about him is that he's had pretty high levels of success in different types of writing. Well, I would say the majority of writers are known, mainly for, well, this person's a poet, this person's a fiction writer, this person writes nonfiction and, kind of historical stuff, things like that. Plays, playwrights, things. Most authors have kind of are fit generally into a certain box. That doesn't mean that's all they write. That means that's what they're primarily known for. Wolff has had pretty pretty good high levels of success in different types of writing. Short story is what he's widely known for. His 2 stories in particular, this one, Hunters in the Snow, and also A Bullet in the Brain, which I thought about having y'all read, but nah, I decided I'd finish with this one because A, I love it, and B, it's just a very bizarre story. Extreme. Well, so is Bullet in the Brain, but anyway, as I said, he's had success in pretty much every corner of writing, that major form of writing that exists. To the general public, he's probably best known for memoirs. He wrote a memoir in 1989, I believe. Let me make sure I got these dates right. Yeah, 89 he published This Boy's Life, which is kind of a memoir of his life growing up. And he did have kind of an unusual life. His biological father left at a very young age. He moved out to the Pacific Northwest near Washington State, and which coincidentally is where this story takes place. Hunters in the Snow takes place right outside of Spokane, Washington. Um, his mom remarried. The stepfather was a complete just alcoholic, abusive, horrible person, and he wrote a memoir about that part of his life called This Boy's Life. And it was extremely popular, won several awards, and it was also in 1993, it was made into a movie called This Boy's Life, and it starred Leonardo DiCaprio as Tobias Wolff in the film Toby Wolff. So Leonardo DiCaprio played him in 1993, so that's pretty cool. His abusive stepfather was Robert De Niro, and I believe the mom was Ellen Barkin. So it was a pretty big movie. It got a lot of high critical acclaim. So yeah, he's a pretty big deal in the literary world for many different reasons. Now, when we read Raymond Carver, you know, I talked about that thing, that dirty realism type thing. Wolff uh, has been put into that box too, where a lot of his stories have been described as dirty realism. Uh, Again, I think that's kind of a redundancy, or it's unnecessary, you know, to say dirty realism because you know real life is not very clean, and I mean that literally and metaphorically, you know. So I just consider it realism. Now, uh, as with Carver, I think Wolff is very good at making uh, kind of three-dimensional characters, you know, where they're believable as real people. And just like us, at least I can't, I'm not speaking for y'all, but for me, his characters are usually have various levels of flaws, from you know minor flaws to extreme destructive flaws. And I think that's kind of how real people are. So I appreciate that in his work. What I also like about his stories, and it is kind of, I think it is an amazing feat, is that uh, particularly in this story, Hunters in the Snow, that I had you all read, um, the events are so bizarre. I mean, you talk about just an insane turn of events after, you know, after Kenny gets shot by Tub. What Frank and Tub do in the latter half of the story is just incredibly bizarre. I mean, it's insanely bizarre. However, the way Wolff presents it, I personally find it highly believable. And shocking revelation here, folks, I read a lot, and I read a lot of stuff that's not fiction. I've read several real life stories, um, whether they be through news outlets or whatever, where true events were very similar to what happens in this story, and every bit as bizarre. And again, you know, that it's a total cliche, truth is stranger than fiction, but um, when you read this story, I hope you don't think that the events that transpire after, you know, Tubb shoots Kenny are just way out in left field and too far removed from reality. Not really. There's been a lot of stories that are similar with similar things happening. And I'll probably talk about, you know, use some of those as reference points as we actually get into the story. But as far as Wolff himself goes, I think he's a very interesting guy. In the 60s, I'm not sure the exact year. I think it was around 68. or so. That's of course when the United States was really, really, really becoming involved in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War. And some of you may know, you may or may not know, I'm not sure, but that was the last time that the United States had the draft. Now, if you were a full-time college student, you could get a deferment. There were different things you could do to be exempt from the draft, but Wolff just, you know, in his own words, I've actually seen him in interviews say this. You know, he was young. He was kind of a his heroes were, you know, like Hemingway, who we just read, was one of his greatest heroes, or is. I keep referring to him in the past tense as if he's still alive. Hemingway is one of his greatest heroes, not just as a literary figure, but also the life that Hemingway led, you know, the life of adventure. And in '68, you know, when Vietnam was really taking off, at least the U.S. involvement was really escalating. Wolff was young, and he just had a very action-oriented, vigorous spirit, and he said, "Hey, I'm not going to be drafted. I'm going to volunteer." So he volunteered and ended up going not just through basic and AIT, which is your specialty, whatever your occupation is going to be. He also was selected for special forces. So he went through special forces training. He was completed it. He learned the language. He literally can speak Vietnamese. He didn't know a few phrases and stuff. He learned to speak Vietnamese. And he went over to Vietnam as part of a special forces unit and was there for some time. And he's also written a memoir about his time in Vietnam, and it's pretty harrowing. So he came back, finished his college studies, and went to Oxford in England, and then ended up at Stanford. After he graduated from Stanford, he taught there for a while. He did teach English, obviously, but he was actually head of the eventually became head of the creative writing program at Stanford, and some of his former students are big time authors. One, there's a couple that you may. Jay McInerney was one of his students, and he wrote a highly, highly successful novel called Bright Lights, Big City, which is also a memoir of his own life growing up in New York at the height of when it was just a free-for-all party, you know, all the studio, all that stuff going on. And also one of his former writing students is Alice Sebold, and that's one that you all may recognize because she wrote the insanely successful novel The Lovely Bones, which was also adapted into a film. As was Bright Lights Big City. It was all that was also adapted into a film, which and both films were highly successful. Um, what you think about them is, you know, I've read The Lovely Bones and I've seen the film, and I kind of have mixed feelings about both, but that's just my personal opinion. However, so he's apparently also not just a really really good writer. He's also a really good teacher. So again, just a interesting guy, and based on all the interviews I've seen, he seems very approachable and level-headed dude. So with that said, um, I want to spend some time talking about the story now. This story is I really absolutely love this story, and one of the reasons I love it is because the first time I read it, I did not see what happens in the latter half. Didn't see that coming. I didn't. However, when you finish it, if you go back and look at it, you'll see that he does give some subtle, not punch you over the head, foreshadowing that this story is going to take a pretty drastic turn. But again, hindsight's 2020. So going back and rereading it, at least me, and I've read the story of I have no idea how many times because I usually assign it every semester or every other semester, and I I don't remember the first time I read it, but it was probably in the sometime in the late 80s, mid to late 1980s. Uh, but when you go back and reread through it, you can notice, oh, okay, so he dropped a little hint here that this was not going to turn out well. Whereas in, like A Good Man is Hard to Find by O'Connor, her foreshadowing is more, even a semi-alert reader within the first page of that story should have a pretty good idea that something's she's kind of throwing a little trail here saying that these folks are not going to have a good time on this so-called vacation they're about to go on. However, here it's a little bit more subtle. I honestly, the first time I read it, had no idea what to expect. I was like, okay, well, it's three guys. One of them's kind of a jerk. Uh, one of them's kind of a pushover, and one of them's just kind of in the middle between the two of them. So we'll see where it goes. And I was really, really very surprised. So I just mentioned the three characters, and now I'm gonna reduce them, even though I believe in the story they're not they're pretty well fleshed out characters. I'm gonna reduce them just for the sake of the rest of this discussion. So you have Kenny, Frank, and Tub. Those are the three main characters. Anybody else in the story is purely for plot. This is a very plot-driven story as well. But Kenny, Frank, and Tub are really the characters. Everybody else is a peripheral, just there to make certain or allow to allow for certain things to happen. So Kenny's kind of the bully, right? He's a jerk. Let's just not really sugarcoat that. He's a jerk. He likes to ridicule other people. He likes to abuse other people. He has a very pessimistic outlook. Um, his sense of humor is pretty dark, pretty deception seems to be a character trait that he uses for humor. However, all three characters are deceptive. Now we'll talk about the ways that the different ways in which each character uses it. Kenny is deceptive, but he does it, I think, from reading this story so many times, Kenny's deception is more kind of at the expense of others for him to either feel superior or just for what he thinks is a good joke. Um, Frank is kind of the guy in the middle. You know, he's kind of, at the beginning at least, Frank's kind of the peacekeeper. He's kind of the buffer, the Switzerland, if you will, of the friends. He's the neutral zone. But Kenny is also deceptive. I mean, not Kenny, Frank. Sorry, excuse me. Frank is also deceptive. And Frank's deception, while not, as we soon find out, Kenny's deception turns out to be deadly, but unintentionally. But Frank is deceptive too. And Frank's deception is on a whole, is on a completely different level. He's deceptive to himself, which Kenny is not. Kenny has no deceptions about who he is to himself. Frank, however, is deceptive to himself, and he's also deceptive to those around him, particularly Tub. He's, I'm not going to call him a liar because I think that might be too strong, but he's deceptive. He withholds truths, but he thinks he's doing it kind of for the right reasons, whereas a liar is just lying for, to truly just deceive people. Frank, I think, in his own mind is justifying the deception that he's got, even deceiving himself, is it's more for justification than anything, not for deception. Okay, so and there, I make that's a pretty distinct difference. Now Tub is the kind of the punching bag, especially for Kenny, and to some extent Frank, because Frank does at the very beginning does kind of stick up for him a little bit, but as the story goes on, Frank kind of just turns his back on Tub a little bit, and that changes by the end of the story. But towards the mid part of the story, Frank kind of almost, this is kind of a story about taking sides, and he kind of feels like he's on Kenny's side when they first get to the destination where they're trying to find some deer to hunt. And there's a variety of reasons why he may be doing that. I think one of the reasons may be because it's clear to me that Tub and Frank are both scared of Kenny. They fear this guy for whatever reason. He's seems a very kind of an intimidating guy that you don't really want to cross. And Frank certainly seems to acquiesce a little bit to Kenny's abuse to Tub when they're out in the woods looking for, when they're hunting. He kind of, I won't go so far as to say he sides with Kenny, but he kind of doesn't defend Tub anymore. Whereas when they first get into the truck, after this horrible joke, again, Kenny's jokes, when he literally tries to run Tub over when they're picking him up, Frank defends Tub a little bit there, but after they get out into the woods, he kind of abandons that, which also speaks to his character. Now, again, Tub is just kind of the punching bag, and again, when we get out into the woods where they're hunting on this other family's property, with consent, of course, Tub has a breaking point and it's crossed, and we see what happens. So let's talk about that. Okay, when they get out to where they're going to go hunting, it starts off all, you know, kind of innocent enough. They actually show that they're being responsible because there's a no hunt. You know, they're following the deer, and the tracks go into someone else's private property, and they have no hunting signs up. Well, at that point, Kenny decides, which again is showing kind of that he's not just a one-dimensional horrible person. He says, hey, we can't hunt here without permission, so let's go talk to the landowners and tell them what we're doing and get permission. And of course, they're granted permission. Now, as you know, as they're hunting and going on, not much is happening, and they're not finding any deer. But in order for the rest of the story to happen, there has to be some events. This is why I'm saying the story has a heavy, is driven heavily by the plot. And by the plot, I mean the events that happen in succession. A leads to B, B leads to C, C. Having Kenny going to talk to the homeowner, the property owner, is vital to the rest of the story because it sets up the chain of events. Just as in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, the grandmother's her own deception when she remembers that the house is actually in Tennessee but refuses to tell Bailey, which would have completely erased everything that happens afterwards, the entire family being killed. Kenny does a similar act here. We know later that when he goes in to talk to the homeowner tells him, yeah, you can hunt on my property, but I need you to do me a favor. And we soon find out what that favor is. You know, as they're hunting, they can't find anything. They go back, they see this poor, pitiful dog, and Kenny plays this whole game, right? He points at a tree first. So this shows an escalation. Now you have to remember, Frank and Tub have no idea what he talked to the property owner about. They just know that they were given permission to hunt. So Kenny puts on this show. He says, "I hate you, tree." Boom, he shoots the tree. And "I hate you, oh, dog." And boom, he shoots and kills the dog. Now the other two are just shocked at this point. As far as they're concerned, Kenny's a maniac. And he points his rifle at Tub and says, "I hate you, Tub." And boom, we know what happens. Tub shoots him first. Now, later on, we find out that the homeowner had actually told Kenny, "Hey, you can hunt on my property, but the favor I need from you is I need you to kill my dog. He can't, the dog, I love, the owner loved the dog too much. The dog was sick. The dog was old, couldn't eat much anymore, was in pain, was suffering, and the owner loved the dog so much that he couldn't bring himself to kill the dog. So he basically told Kenny, if you do me this favor and put my poor dog out of its misery, you guys can hunt to your heart's content on my property." Well, Kenny, again, being this kind of sadistic sense of humor, thought it would be a funny joke. So he shoots the tree and shoots the dog, and then he points his rifle at Tub. Now, if you're Tub, what would you be thinking, honestly, in this succession of events? What would be going through your mind? Hey, this guy just killed a tree, which is just, it's a living thing. A tree is alive, but it's a tree. So he escalates from a tree to a dog, which is and this is in seconds, y'all. You have to remember, this is happening literally in seconds. So he goes from there to a living creature, a helpless dog, and kills it. He points that rifle at me, y'all, and I've got one in my hands. I'm going to do exactly what Tub did. Because at that point, in that situation, Tub had no other reason to think anything other than his life was in danger. This guy just went from a tree to a dog and pointed his rifle at me. Nope. So at that point, this is where the story, the drastic turn takes place. And if you think about it here, at this point in the story, Kenny was kind of in charge. He was kind of telling the other two were kind of just doing what he told them to. Now Kenny's been shot. And right before this, Frank was kind of siding with Kenny against Tub. He was kind of joining in. Kenny kept saying, probably been 10 years since you've seen your own balls. And they're just going off on him. And Frank was kind of just going along with it. He was, which is again another mark on Frank's character. He's kind of, it seems like he wants to be the popular guy, and we'll find out more about that later. So he'll kind of turn his back on his own ideals or his own morals if he thinks it's going to make him popular. And at this point in the story, up until the shooting, he thought being on Kenny's side was a little bit more important than sticking up for Tub. And even before the shooting happened, Tub had told him straight up, you ought to be ashamed of yourself, man. I used to stick up for you when we were in high school, and now you're letting this guy abuse me like this. So Frank's wishy-washy. He's a weak character, I believe. He has very little conviction, and he's very good at doing stupid things and justifying them for himself. Tub is just Tub. Tub seems to suffer from personal, like his own abuse. He has a seemingly very low self-esteem, and this could be a result of his weight and the others constantly making fun of him, particularly Kenny. However, when he shot Kenny, I think, given the circumstances, if this ever went to a real courtroom, it would have been considered self-defense or justifiable. Because this man just went from a tree to a dog in a matter of seconds and then points it right at Tub. I think most juries in anywhere would say, yeah, you had to do what you had to do. It would have probably most likely been ruled justified. Um, However, let's think about this too. Now we know that these friends go all the way back to high school. Probably, maybe even before that. We don't know, but we know for a fact that they were going through high school. And we do also know that for years, Tub has been being abused by Kenny. You know, he's always been Kenny's kind of verbal and just his punching bag. Just he's always constantly putting him down. So one could argue that subconsciously, Tub saw the opportunity to get rid of this guy and get away with it because of the circumstances. As I said, almost any courtroom in America, a jury would say, hey man, you had no choice. It was you or him. And boom, he would have got that. So it would have been kind of a win-win if you think about it. He gets rid of this guy that's been tormenting him permanently, not doesn't move to another state or try to get him. You know, I know this is an old story, but he doesn't unfriend him on Facebook. He unfriends him from life, basically, presumably. Although he doesn't actually die in the story, we know that by the end of the story, he's going to die. Um, so now that this has happened, we see this bizarre chain of events where they're like, "Hey, we got to get him to a hospital." Now, depending on how you look at it, um, and you all know this is during basically a blizzard. Once they get him in the back of the truck, and I used to live in Spokane, Washington, y'all. Winters are no joke there. Okay, you think it's like, oh man, it was cold the other day here in Gwinnett County, or man, we got an inch of snow or 3 inches. Spokane and out in the woods out there is a whole different kind of winter. Trust me. Um, they're in this beat up truck. The window's broken, so the cold air comes pulling in. They've got their buddy in the back of the truck bleeding to death. Now, he did get shot in the stomach, which I guess if you're going to get shot somewhere above the waist, um, that's not the worst place to get shot because it does take a long time for you to bleed out. And of course, since it misses the organs, and we learn later that he doesn't have an appendix, so because if your appendix gets ruptured, you're going to bleed to death rather quick. But just getting shot in the stomach, it takes a relatively long time to die. You basically die slow and painfully from blood loss. So this guy's in excruciating pain in the back of a truck with a few blankets on him. It's in a blizzard. It's freezing cold. And as soon as they take off to go to where they think the hospital is, they kind of forget about him. You know, Frank and Tub just forget about Kenny, and they start having this kind of bizarre opening up, kind of coming out to each other conversation. You know, Frank tells Tub, "Hey man, I'm leaving my wife for the babysitter," which that one caught me off guard quite a bit. Which that was alluded to at the beginning, in the beginning of the story, if you remember. But Frank quickly shut Kenny down. But you know, this guy's going to leave his wife and his children for a 15-year-old babysitter. So, if up to this point in the story you thought Frank was a pretty decent person, sorry y'all, that's beyond a character flaw. And in my personal opinion, reading this story, that this Frank ultimately, as far as people that I would actually want to be around, Frank to me comes off as a much, much worse person than Kenny ever was. Kenny was a bully, which is bad, but Frank's going to leave his wife and children for a 15-year-old. There's I, that's a Freudian field day, is what I'd call that. There's something drastically wrong there, and I really don't want to go into any more detail about it. But we learned that Tub, who kept blaming his weight on a gland problem, you know, I can't help it, and he tried to in public, you know, he'd eat the little carrots and the eggs and claim to be on a diet. But we know right at the beginning when he falls down that he's got cookies and sandwiches. He's a binge eater. which again, these are real problems that real people have, which is why I believe these characters so much, and I don't think they're just one-dimensional. Kenny, now if once we learn all this, and Frank and Tub have this kind of, hey, we're going to be straight with each other, um, thing, and they decide, hey, let's, now that we're really getting to know each other for real after all these years, let's go celebrate. They stop at this roadside bar and start, having eaten and having some coffee. Their friend is still out in the truck bleeding to death, and it's a race at this point. Is he going to freeze to death before he bleeds to death, or is he going to bleed to death before he freezes to death? They don't they don't have a care in the world about this guy. He is so far from their thoughts. And of course, we know they leave, but then they go to a different bar, a different, kind of roadhouse, and they're just putting everything out on the table. Hey, man, I wanna leave my wife and my kids for a 15-year-old. And Tubbs like, hey, that's okay, man. When I kept saying that the reason I'm overweight is because of my glands, it's not. I don't have. There's nothing wrong with my glands. I just eat all the time and now they're just indulging each other because we know Frank says, "Hey, that's great, buddy." Orders him a ridiculous amount of pancakes. Just hog them down, and he does, and they're just having this grand time, kind of getting all this stuff off their chest while their friend is dying. Now, once we know all these secrets about them and that they both have these highly flawed personalities, in retrospect, if we go back, their friend who's out in the cold and in the back of a truck, either freezing or bleeding to death, well, both technically, I guess, it seems to me that Kenny is the only person who was honest. Kenny didn't seem to me to have, he was on the surface, I'll put it that. Now, I'm not saying he's a good person. He's not a likable person at all. I'm not justifying anything about him other than the fact that he's actually honest. Now, if again, I keep comparing this back to A Good Man Is Hard to Find. If we go back to that, the grandmother, while I don't think she deserved to die in, by any means whatsoever, the grandmother was deceptive. She lied. She manipulated. She was dishonest. She was just a what I would consider a bad person. Now, the misfit was a horrible person. He would kill somebody to save his own hide without blinking, without a second thought. However, he was about he was in the absolute truest sense brutally honest. He didn't hide anything about who he was. The grandmother was fake as you can get. Where she came from, her lineage, everything about her was false. Now, to certain degrees, Frank and Tub are false as well. They have facades. They're faking who they actually are. They're hiding who they actually are. They're lying to themselves to justify their actions, and they're lying to others about their actions. Kenny doesn't seem to have any of those issues. Kenny seems to be Kenny. Hey, I'm Kenny. This is who I am. Take it or leave it. Well, depending on which way you look at it, if you truly believe that Tub thought that Kenny was really going to shoot him next, which would be okay to think, then Tub merely shot him in self-defense. I tend to think of it a little bit differently. I personally don't think Kenny was going to shoot Tub. I think he was that much of a idiot and extreme joker that the dog he had no problem with, because he knew that the owner wanted him to kill the dog, and he was actually being compassionate by killing the dog. The dog was suffering, the dog was in misery, but he thought it would be funny to say, look how crazy I am, and say, nah, Tub, I'm just kidding, ha ha ha, I got you, buddy, I bet you, crapped your pants or something. That just seems to be the type of person he is. So I don't think he had any intention whatsoever of actually shooting Tub, but Tub may or may not have thought that. However, subconsciously, based on all these years of being the butt of all of Kenny's jokes and abuse, he might have just thought, hey, this is the best chance I'm ever going to get to kill this some whatever you want to throw in there, to kill this guy and I will get away with it 100%, and a major problem in my life will be eliminated. That's kind of how I look at it. But that's not by any stretch the only way to look at it. Um, so once this all, these guys are they're just having some kind of epiphany and, hey, this is what's really going on. This is Kenny's just dying. And when they leave, oops, I left the directions back at the place. Don't worry about it. We'll find it. However, we know by the last line of the story, they're going not in the wrong direction. They're going completely opposite of where the nearest hospital is. So to me, there's no other reason. There's no reason to think that somehow they get somewhere where Kenny gets help and survives. I mean, Kenny dies. He doesn't actually die while the story is taking place or occurring, but he's dead. He's not going to make it out of this. And guess what? Frank and Tubb have a perfect alibi. A 100% airtight alibi. All Frank has to say is, yeah, he killed this dog, and then he said, now, and I hate you, and he's pointed it right at my buddy here, and my buddy, he had to do what he had to do. No other witnesses. Even if you think about it, even when they go back to the property owner's house, when the property owner says, he says, I need to use your phone. So, you shot your friend, huh? He goes, yeah, it was an accident. He goes, okay, well, go ahead. They're covered. They are 100% covered. However, one thing to think about, though, is that both Frank and Tubb, regardless of what happened, are going to have to live with this in the back of their minds. So now they just have another level of deception. They have to keep lying to themselves and to other people about this thing too. First, we've got Frank lying about thinking he's in love with a 15-year-old babysitter and he's going to leave his wife and kids, which not much. And Tubb, who claims that he has some kind of glandular disorder, when in fact he's just a compulsive eater. He's just a binge eater. And neither of them want actual help for their real issues, but now they've got something else they have to hide. So just think about the psychological toll that's going to have on them for the remainder of their lives. And again, you can call this dirty realism if you want, but the story is so bizarre and so outlandish, but by the end of it, I believe it is 100% believable, which is a major feat in my estimation of the talent that Tobias Wolff has as a writer, to take this ridiculous situation, particularly after Kenny gets shot, and make it just completely believable. And I will just go ahead and finish there. This will be the last video on anything that we read, because we're done with the reading assignments. But I do want to reiterate, y'all, these final essays are important. If I don't have it by May 6th, that's on you. I cannot do anything about that. Please make sure you get it done. And I'll probably post another short video just as a reminder when we're coming up to the due date. I'll be putting stuff on announcements on D2L. There won't be anything else under assignments because you have no more assignments. So congratulate yourself if you've done everything so far. Get that final thing done, and let's do it. Let's finish on a high note. All right, I'll see y'all soon.